on that. Good afternoon. It's always a pleasure to see so many of you here this afternoon, and we're most pleased to start a new program with the National Conference of Black Mayors, and this is the Think Tank. And we are pleased to no end to have the distinguished gentleman that we have here this afternoon that will lecture to you on various topics. And I am most pleased that the executive director has worked me very hard all week, so I have an opportunity to shift the responsibility to someone else. And every time I get a chance, I do just that. So the moderator this afternoon will be the second vice president. And it is with great pleasure that I turn this over to Mr. Mayor Bowser from New Jersey. Mayor Bowser.
Good afternoon. This is, as Mayor Dorn, who is the first vice president, our president, had, Harvey Johnson in Jackson, Mississippi, is out because he has a very crucial race going on for re-election. And he wanted Mayor Dorn to take his place, so he just passed the ball off to me. But as you know, our theme for the conference is developing economic empowerment for our people. We need to own something.
Amen.
We need to keep some of our money in our community and turn it over and over. So we decided, National Conference of Black Mayors, that we would have a think tank. And as I told the minister earlier, it's not the first time we had to think. But I think we need to get smart about what we do. Now, we have over 541 African-American mayors in the United States. You should give a hand for that. We represent over 20 million people. That's a lot of folks. That's a lot of money. So what we decided to do was bring in some people that have been working with this problem, working with social issues, civil rights issues, have them come and talk to us and make us smarter than we are. You got to go to the people who know what the problems are, but they also know what the solutions are. So each one of these gentlemen up here are going to bring their own perspective. And we are so fortunate that we have Minister Louis Farrakhan with us today. Now, we don't have the time to give all the bio background because we're running late, but also we'd be here for another hour and a half just getting to that point. But we also have Dr. Manning Marble, who's a professor of public affairs, political science at Columbia University. And Mr. George Curry, who's the founder of Merge Magazine and the president of the National Association of Black Publishers. Curry. Now, we didn't draw straws for this, but I think since to my right is Dr. Marable, I think we can start with you. We're going to try to limit your presentation, but make sure you cover everything, all right? But we're so happy to have you with us. Would you come up, Doctor?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This is a historic occasion for African Americans who are desperately searching for new vision and new solutions to some very old problems. And hopefully this afternoon, thanks to the presence of Minister Farrakhan, we can begin a long overdue and long delayed dialogue toward re-envisioning what a new civil rights movement must look like in the 21st century. Beginning in the early 1990s, over the last 15 years, we have witnessed collectively a broad assault against the black freedom struggle in this country. And that assault has been ideological, economic, cultural, and political. There was a dedicated, concerted effort by conservatives to literally rewrite the language of the civil rights movement and turn it upside down, in effect to rewrite the American public's memory about what had actually transpired in this country in the fight to obliterate and overturn Jim Crow racial segregation in the 1950s and 1960s. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s image and words were cynically manipulated to provide a posthumous endorsement for outlawing affirmative action programs and minority economic set-asides. An important turning point, in retrospect, occurred in the fall of 1996 with the passage in California of Proposition 209. Now, 209 won by a margin of 54 to 46%. And the initiative outlawed the use, to quote the initiative, of, quote, race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in many aspects of public life. Now, thousands and thousands of African American voters, confused by the language of the initiative, failed to understand that affirmative action would be outlawed in California and actually voted in favor of it. Now, on the day of the referendum in November 1996, the LA Times exit polls on affirmative action indicated that a majority of California voters, white, Latino, Asian, and black, overwhelmingly supported affirmative action. Nevertheless, those same voters went to the polls and voted for something that was confusing, and they outlawed the thing that they were in favor of. White moderates and liberals who had long defended race-based affirmative action programs began to waffle and largely collapse before the conservative onslaught. And to speak honestly about the situation, largely setting the tone of retreat, was President William Jefferson Clinton, who in his re-election bid in 1996 declared that he had, quote, done more to eliminate affirmative action programs I didn't think were fair and tighten up others than all of my predecessors combined. By the beginning of the 21st century, under the new regime of George Bush, under the new regime of George Bush, we have seen the emergence of what I call the new racial domain. We have existed as people of African descent on the American continent for 4 centuries, for nearly 400 years. And we have suffered through 3 different forms of racial domination. Slavery for 249 years, Jim Crow segregation for nearly a century, ghettoization throughout the 20th century, and now in the 21st century, a 4th racial domain has emerged. And that is the most insidious form of racial domination of all, because the signs reading white and colored have been taken down. The language is race neutral. We now live under the aegis of a colorblind society, but it is a colorblind system of racial inequality. What are the characteristics of that system of racial domination? As I put it, the system that we are fighting against today, if one thinks about this as a three-legged stool, or as a kind of triad, or an unholy trinity, these three principles are, of the new colorblind racism, are mass unemployment, mass incarceration, and mass disenfranchisement. And in the few minutes that I have this afternoon, I'd like to speak very briefly to these three principles, how they work and undermine economic development and social development for our people, and what can be done about it. The cycle of destruction starts with chronic mass unemployment and poverty. Real incomes for the majority of working poor people actually fell significantly during Clinton's second term in office. After the 1996 Welfare Act, social safety nets that existed for 60 years as a legacy of the New Deal and then later the Great Society were largely pulled apart. As the Bush administration took power, chronic joblessness began to spread to black workers in the manufacturing sector. By last year, 2004, in cities such as New York, fully 1/2 of all black male adults were outside of the paid labor force. Mass unemployment inevitably feeds mass incarceration. 1/3 of all prisoners were unemployed at the time of their arrests. Others who are imprisoned average less than $20,000 annual income in the year prior to their arrest. When Attica prison uprising occurred in 1971, there were only 12,500 prisoners in New York State's correctional facilities. By 2001, New York State had over 70,000 people in its jails and prisons. Over 80% of the prisoners in the state where I live, in New York, come from only 7 communities in that state. 7 communities, overwhelmingly black and Hispanic. Nationwide, in the last 30 years, the number of people in U.S. jails and prisons has risen from 200,000 to 2.2 million. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws adopted in the 80s and 90s in these states stripped judges of discretionary powers in sentencing, imposing draconian terms on first-time and nonviolent offenders. Parole has been made much more restrictive all over the country, and in 1995, Pell Grant subsidies supporting educational programs for prisoners were ended. For those fortunate enough to successfully navigate the criminal justice system, to move beyond and get out of prison, they discovered that both the federal and state governments explicitly prohibit the employment of convicted former prisoners in literally hundreds of occasions. The cycle of unemployment begins again. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, what are the biggest impacts of mass incarceration? The greatest victims of mass incarceration in this country? And keep in mind that 2.2 million people in prison is only a snapshot of the new racialized inequality, because the total number of people in the U.S. criminal justice system at any given time today is 7 million people who are either in jail on probation, parole, or awaiting trial. 7 million people. 650,000 people come out of jail every year. Another 650 to 700,000 go into the cycle of the prison industrial complex every year. 1 in 5 Americans now has a criminal record, and it's not just all black folk either. So you're talking about a massive machine of racialized and class inequality that brings in millions of people every year. We are witnessing in our time the greatest mass use of the criminal justice system to warehouse the unemployed, black people, and Hispanics that literally the world has ever seen. What are the impacts of this? The greatest casualties, beyond any question, are young African American young men and young women. In a 2000 study that was commissioned by the Clinton administration's Justice Department and 6 leading foundations, they document the vast racial disparities that exist in the juvenile justice system. At Columbia University last weekend, we just held a conference on the crisis of warehousing young black men and women. And we have seen, I see George is writing a note, so I know that I have to wrap this up. But I do need to talk a little bit more about this for about 30 seconds. African Americans under the age of 18 comprise 15% of their national age group, but they currently represent 26% of those who are arrested. After entering the criminal justice system, black and white juveniles with the identical criminal records are treated in fundamentally, radically different ways. According to the Justice Department study, among white youth offenders, 66% are referred to juvenile courts, while only 31% of African American youth are taken there. Blacks comprise 44% of those detained in juvenile jails, 46% of those tried in adult criminal courts, 58% of all juveniles who are warehoused in adult prison. In practical terms, this means that a young African American who is arrested and charged with a crime has more than a 6 times more likelihood of being assigned to prison than white youthful offenders. And for a young black male who does not have a criminal record, charged with a drug-related crime for the first offense, compared to a comparable white youth, that young black man has a 48 times greater likelihood of spending time in jail. 48 times. Now, as a social scientist, you can't explain that away by simply saying that perhaps black people are unlucky or that somehow the criminal justice system is imbalanced. This is simply a manifestation of structural racism. Now, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about this? It destroys human capital. It destroys the capacity of millions of people to be gainfully employed. What I'm going to argue this afternoon is that we need to build a new civil rights movement. We need to desperately build a new civil rights movement that challenges and focuses on enhancing civic capacity and building leadership. Leaders aren't born, they're made. They're made, they're constructed. We need to train a new generation of leaders to challenge the issues of mass unemployment, mass incarceration, and mass disfranchisement. I need to spend 30 seconds, George, on this. All right. Mass incarceration breeds political disfranchisement. 15% of all black males now have lost the right to vote in this country, either temporarily or permanently. We talk about mass incarceration. The state of Florida, 818,000 people have lost the right to vote in that state for life. There is an appellate procedure, but only 1,000 people get it back every year. All right? The state of Mississippi, Merle Evers and I have been working. We just finished writing a small book on Medgar Evers. So I've been going to Mississippi several times over the last few years. 1/3 of all black men have lost the right to vote in the state of Mississippi. So we need a new civil rights movement that recognizes that the issue is no longer trying to get an integrated seat in the front of a bus. It is no longer about trying to desegregate a public school. It is about trying to stop and halt the draconian imprisonment of millions of our children and ourselves in this prison industrial complex. It is about reversing mandatory minimum sentencing laws. It is about turning around and re-enfranchising the millions of black women and men, but mostly males, who have lost the right to vote because they have been former prisoners. That new civil rights movement has to take its parochial blinders off. We need all hands on deck, from the Nation of Islam to the NAACP, to the Urban League, to every organization, fraternity, and sorority that exists. To build that capacity and that new leadership requires us to break out of the old way of thinking about advancing specific constituencies to see what the whole is. And it is important for us, finally, to have a clear internationalist perspective. We come from a people that have produced a Paul Robeson, a Martin R. Delaney, and a Henry Highland Garnett, and a Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, and Elijah Muhammad, men and women with clear vision who understood that as long as the struggle against racial domination is defined solely by the U.S. nation state, we will get nowhere. We will get nowhere. Developing an economic strategy of empowerment requires leadership, defining the problem of racial domination, this colorblind racism that exists today, this new racial domain, and also developing concrete allies all over the world that sees that our struggle for empowerment cannot be won in isolation from out the rest of the world. The vast majority of the people of the world look to us, African Americans, to provide the moral high ground and vision for resistance and renewal. We have done this before. That is our historic mandate. We must do it again. Thank you.
I'm charged with moderating this discussion. When he says 30 seconds next time, I know what that means. We apologize for being a little late, and the format is going to be this. He's had his speech, opening statement, and then the minister will have his, and we'll have a conversation here, and we'll have plenty of time to have a conversation with you included. So that's the format. When we started, a lady kind of reminded me of the time that Jimmy Carter went to give an address to the CBC, and he was like really, really late. He said, I really apologize for being late. I ran to Alex Haley and asked him how was his family. Mr. Farrakhan.
Thank you, Brother George Curry. Excuse me for being seated, but I had a little back problem that interfered with my sciatic nerve, and I've never experienced such pain in all my life, so you have to forgive me for sitting down, but it's just temporary. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, we give him praise and thanks for his mercy and his goodness to the human family. And the greatest of God's mercies is that whenever any segment of humanity goes astray, he always sends a prophet or messenger to give that segment of humanity what is called divine revelation, to guide them back to the straight path of God, that they might once again come into his divine favor. We thank God for Moses and the Torah, or the Old Testament. We thank him for Jesus and the Gospel, or the New Testament. We thank him for Muhammad and the Quran. Peace be upon all of these worthy servants of God. And as a student of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, I could never thank God enough for raising that man up among us to lead, teach, and guide us back to a path that would ultimately bring us again into success, prosperity, and divine favor. Let me say at the outset, first, I greet all of you with the greeting words of peace. Assalamu alaikum. Ooh. Which means in English, peace be unto you. Let me say first how honored I am to have been invited by the black mayors of this country to share in this dialogue with such distinguished brethren as George Curry and Dr. Professor Manning Marable. I am honored to be in your company. I listened very, very carefully to Dr. Marable, but as a spiritual person, I look at problems and solutions through the eyes of Scripture, because I believe that the prophets of God, if they saw, and they did see, they saw what we are suffering right now, and they wrote about it. If they could see, and they saw the condition of America, and they wrote about it. And they gave solutions to the problems, and they wrote about it. So, as a scholar would consult a reference book to reference what as a base for discussion, and a lawyer would reference legal cases as a basis for argument, my reference will have to be Scripture. Now, thank you. Now, my very wonderful brother, Dr. Manning Marable, used numbers. He said that we have been in America 400 years. He talked about mass unemployment, mass incarceration, mass disenfranchisement, and a calculation that this is not an accident. This is by design, and our youth, young men and women, and our elderly too, are at risk in what our brother describes as a new colorblind racism. I love this terminology, Dr. Marable. Now, as a student of Scripture and a student of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, I want to try to put this into perspective, because it's talked about from the book of Genesis all the way to the book of Revelations, but since my time is severely limited, I shall not endeavor to take you through the entire Scripture. But suffice it to say that in geometry, when we were studying our theorems, they said in one of the theorems, if side angle side of triangle A is equal to side angle side of triangle B, then the triangles are said to be congruent. That's a hypothesis, but if our 400 years in slavery connects to the children of Israel's 400 years in bondage, if our problem with Pharaoh, with the government of the United States of America is as the children of Israel's problem with Pharaoh, and if our suffering and persecution in America is as the children of Israel suffered and were persecuted in ancient Egypt, then there's congruence here. So let's take a closer look at this congruence. Now, the children of Israel seem to be multiplying quite well. They didn't have any weapon, but what they were shooting seemed to be producing a lot of results. And so Pharaoh became upset because the demographers of that day showed that Pharaoh's birth and death was like equal. So he was at zero population growth while the children of Israel were multiplying. So Pharaoh entered into a conspiracy in these words: come, an invitation. Let us deal wisely with them, children of Israel, lest they multiply, join on to an enemy of ours, and come against us. So what was the conspiracy of Pharaoh? Let us kill all the boy babies, spare the females. Now we'll start right there. Now Moses, of course, was commanded by God to go to Pharaoh not to ask for integration. Because the house that the children of Israel were in for 400 years was now under divine plagues. So Moses was not sent to integrate the children of Israel into that house, but to extract them from that house, that God may give them a house of their own. Thus, there was a promised land somewhere. Now, I got to move quick. Now, the skill of the enemy was always to work against the rise of the children of Israel, or the slave. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad said to us, never in history has any slave master made their slave their equal. So it will be foolish for us to think that our former slave masters and their children have a plan to make us equal. The opposite is true. Now we are here in the presence of black mayors, and this is a great thing that over 500 black men and women have ascended from being the children of slaves to the position of governance over cities, some major, some minor, but governance. But governance over somebody else's affairs. So it's like you have been hired to manage what is not yours. So the managers, you are manager. But then there are forces outside of the people that elected you that want to show you how you can manage their affairs to their interests and not to the interests of those who voted you into office. So you will disrespect the people in order to bow down to powers that did not elect you, but control you. for their benefit. And we got to deal with truth. Oh. I have to deal like that. Because that's the only thing that will free us is truth. And that's why Jesus said, you shall know the truth. And the truth shall, future tense, make you free. But the book also says, how can they know except they have a preacher? And how can they have a preacher except he be sent? And he won't be sent by Bush. And he won't be sent by Clinton. Am I finished?
No, go ahead. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh,
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I thought he was calling time.
No, not now.
Now,
No, he's going on.
Wait, no,
He's going on.
I'm gonna be as quick as I can, but in the discussion, in the
ahead.
dialogue, see, all of this will come out. But I wanted to lay the basis for our discussion. Now, hear this. Moses was asking Pharaoh on the orders of God, let my people go. Pharaoh decided, no, I'm not letting them go, but I ain't giving them no justice either. Pharaoh understood the future of the children of Israel, and he did not want to see them attain their future. So in the back of his mind was the destruction of the children of Israel. And so he has let you go. That's why Dr. Marable could say mass unemployment. See, when you were a slave, you was full employment. Naturally, we don't want you to go to the promised land, so we let you go from a job to incarcerate you. So there's mass incarceration. But in the 13th Amendment, you know, Dr. Manning Marable, they always use tricky language. And that's why the people in California could vote against their own will, thinking that they're voting for something good by the misuse of language. Well, in the 13th Amendment, where they said we were citizens, but don't get into any criminal behavior or don't even be charged by the law, because if you're found guilty, you lose what you think you had, but in reality, you don't have it at all. And that's why brother can call for a new civil rights movement. I would add to that a new civil and human rights movement among us, because we have been denied both under this so-called colorblind new form of racism that we are all suffering from. Now watch how this plays out. Mass unemployment, mass incarceration, mass disenfranchisement, and the bottom line of that is death and the destruction of a people.
Exactly.
Now if you add to that the health crisis of Black America, and if you add to that the suffering of our youth being turned in on each other, where drugs have been introduced, guns have been introduced, AIDS has been introduced, then we are in a culture now of death. So when you want to be the mayor of a city that is in revolt against itself, you need solutions, and you need a people that understand that voting a black woman or man into office is not the panacea for our ills. But our people do not understand what you suffer being a mayor and they don't understand the forces that are operating on you that they don't see. But sometimes you may not even have the strength to tell your people that you really can't do for them what you told them during election time that you could do. Now, I'll stop right there and let the discourse begin.
Thank you, Minister. We're going to have a conversation today. No, either one of them could go on, and some try. Again, we will start a conversation up here. It'll be directed, and I will give you equal time out there and to take your question. And we won't be writing them on a card so we can censor it. We don't have censoring anything in here today. Let me get started. I'm going to direct a couple of areas, but Minister Farrakhan, roughly 20 years ago when I was covering Jesse Jackson, I was there in Chicago when you registered for the first time. In fact, I remember your passport had a nice little cover on it, and I got me one just like it. There was a certain optimism then. Contrast where you were 20 years ago politically with where we are today.
Thank you, George. I recognize that politics is not the panacea for our ills, but it is important. Not only registering to vote is important, but understanding what our enlightened self-interest is just as important as having the right to vote. Politics can serve us better than it is serving us if we understood how to use the weapon of the vote. The vote is a shield and a buckler, but it's also a weapon that is used oftentimes against us, and we don't know how to use it either to protect ourselves or to defend ourselves from attack. So today, I'm still saying I believe that black folk should register. I believe that black folk should learn, however, the skill of how to use their vote. And that is why we are this year in the 10th anniversary commemoration of the Million Man March, not calling for a march, but calling for the mass mobilization of Latinos and blacks to produce change. It's not going to come from appealing to government. It's going to come by the sheer force of numbers united to change the realities under which we live.
Man in a certain conservative columnist, I won't call his name, but he was involved in a scandal with the Department of Education, really. But I won't call his name. In fact, I wrote a column called No Money Left Behind, but I won't call his name.
Poor Armstrong.
He said that as much as we've been marching, we should be where we were going by now.
Lord help me. Okay.
How do you respond to that? We're still doing a lot of marching. Minister Farrakhan was careful to point out he was doing mobilization, not just a march. How do you respond to that kind of cynicism?
Well, first off, I think that we have to define what we're seeking more clearly. The minister's absolutely right. Politics or electoral politics should never be viewed as a panacea. And I say that in part as a political scientist, recognizing its limitations in transforming or changing outcomes, social outcomes for people. Nevertheless, it is an essential tool. It is a necessary and absolutely essential tool in the achievement of power. But for me, far more important than politics, quote unquote, is really the struggle for power. But it has to be properly defined. Power is the struggle to realize any people's specific objective interests.
Yes.
Specific objective interests. That presumes that a people know what its specific interests are,
Yes.
and that it can organize collectively
Yes.
to fight to realize those objectives. If people are confused or at war with themselves, then they cannot define collectively what their specific objective interests are.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor.
So the first step in any struggle for empowerment is what we do in our own house to straighten things out. We have been lacking in clarity about what our specific objective interests are. If it is about simply what Dr. Du Bois a century ago called mammonism, or what the hip-hop generation calls bling bling, then it is not going to advance for very long what our objective interests as a people are. So I think that, once again, we have to think about what are our objective interests. And secondly, we have to understand what is the nature of the institutional constraints that undermine our collectivity, our interests as a people. And that's why I talked about these institutional barriers for human development. That is, I put a great deal of emphasis in my presentation on the impact of the criminal justice system and mass incarceration. But disenfranchisement as a result, knocking out 15% of all black male voters throughout the country, as well as mass unemployment, what all of these things do is produce, as the minister said quite correctly, is death, social death and civil death. Yes. That is the destruction of our capacity to realize our objective interests. What they are trying to do, they haven't stopped, the people we're fighting against have not stopped fighting the Civil War. They lost the Civil War, and they were defeated in the struggle to end Jim Crow, but they have not given up the fight. They want to reverse the verdict of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. They want to reverse the 65 Voting Rights Act and dismantle it. They want to remove us as voting as electors. They stole 2000. They probably, being in Ohio, knowing it since I was born in Dayton, knowing it as I do, they stole 2004 in this state. In this state, they want to eliminate us from having any claim on the democratic process. The question is, how do we reverse that process and enhance our capacity to realize our specific interests? And the first step is overcoming and straightening out our own house, overcoming the barriers that separate and divide us, and uniting where we can unite in order to enhance our civic outcomes. If there is anything that we urgently need to do more than anything else, it is building that broad, democratic, pluralistic front of all African American people who can unite around these basic human rights, and the minister is absolutely correct, transcending the civil rights agenda for a human rights agenda, and fighting for these basic principles that enhance the lives and welfare of our children and the next generation of African Americans.
Okay, let me follow up on that. Go ahead. I'm going to ask you something you can add to it, too.
Yes, sir.
What do you think was the greatest accomplishment of the Million Man March, and what you hope to accomplish in October? Then you can tie into that.
Thank you. When the gentleman said all the marching that we've been doing, we should have gotten where we were going. You know, in basketball and in football and in warfare, the art of war is the art of deception. And if you knew where you were going, you wouldn't have to march so much. Right? But the fact that the goalposts kept changing. because somebody else was giving direction to us. But even failed experiments are not failures because they lead to conclusions. And here we've come painfully to a conclusion. After all the marching, all the money that was spent on this program and that, we've come to the conclusion. No one leader can solve this problem. No, wait, I ain't finished. No one organization has the answer.
That's right.
We have come painfully to the conclusion that we need one another. I need Dr. Manning Marable and his brilliance. We need it. We need the NAACP. We need the Urban League. We need the new Black Panther Party. We need each other. And what has happened now that we have come to the conclusion that we need each other and are making moves now to unify so that we don't march anymore, we go right to where we need to go. Now, in the newspaper today, you know, why did you people invite this racially divisive fella, Farrakhan? As though Farrakhan has been dividing you. See, the architect of division is the one who does not wish to see us now painfully coming to the conclusion that we need one another. We need the Baptists. We need the Methodists. We need the Episcopalians, the Catholics, the Church of God in Christ, the Jehovah's Witness. We need each other. And the masses of our people need the learned intellectuals of our people who are hidden away in corporate America, using the power of their brain to build a corporation that they will only have some cheap stock in, but never using our brilliance to lift the masses. And now, Brother George, in this mobilization, we want to put the scholars and scientists together to lift the masses. And because that is the greatest threat to the bloodsuckers of the poor, I'm going to say it just like that. Because the reason that we have so much money but so little to show for it is because there's always somebody there taking it from us, and we are willing to throw it away or give it away on what they call mammonism. I guess that's a good word, you know. Like my brother said last night at the game, spurtability, you know. We make up words, but they fit. But my point, brothers and sisters, is we are at the threshold of the greatest breakthrough since our fathers set the soles of their feet in this country, because now barriers, artificial barriers, are breaking down. And they see now that we are beginning to see the need for one another. So the greatest force of division will be applied today to make sure that we don't mobilize to create a movement for change.
Okay, thank you. Manny, I want to follow up on something you said earlier. You know, a lot of people had their hopes up and they say, oh, you go out and turn people out, especially first-time voters.
Yes.
And they go to Florida and you see what happened there. And they come to Ohio and they see what's happening here.
That's right.
And they say, why should I get involved? Why does it matter? What do you say to somebody who really had their hopes up and you still got George Bush the second time?
All right. All right. One of my favorite quotations from history is by Frederick Douglass, who said, "Without struggle, there is no progress." And those of you who profess to favor freedom but who deprecate struggle are like those who want crops without plowing up the ground. And I love the quotation, but for younger people who lack a historical foundation,
Yes.
a groundedness, that quotation often can ring hollow because without an anchor, without a historical foundation, people look to the superficial rather than to the substantive.
Yeah. Yeah.
They see the short-term losses and feel overwhelmed that despite the mobilization of millions of people into the democratic process, that they feel somehow we have failed in replacing this anti-human, reactionary, economically backward and bankrupt regime we have in the White House. Without understanding that their victory rests more substantively on the disenfranchisement of millions and millions of Americans who are overwhelmingly black, brown, and poor, who don't understand that this colorblind racism of the 21st century, pushing millions outside of the electoral process, stacks the political deck that makes it incredibly difficult for the majority to rule in this country. So part of our obligation is to put young people especially in touch with their own history. That our young people lack often a historical perspective on what we have accomplished, what we have sacrificed to gain where we are, and therefore grow frequently impatient without having an understanding that without struggle there is absolutely no progress. In the 1960s, people asked my generation of activists, well, what do you black powerites want? And we used to respond simply, we want a black face in a high place. We want a black face in a high place. We wanted somebody who looked like us in a position of authority and power. And we believed in what I call in my writing symbolic representation. That is, if you had a black person in the room when the decision was made, that somehow what we wanted would be factored into the equation in the outcome. And frequently, if you had a Harold Washington, that was true. That was true. But the problem is that in the post-civil rights era, where there is no sense of historical groundedness and accountability between leadership and the masses, you can get somebody who looks like you, who talks like you, might even belong to the Deltas or the Lynx. All right. But who doesn't share your community's or your people's agenda. You can have a black person on the Supreme Court, or at least they say he's black. But functionally, Clarence Thomas is the whitest man in America today. So that we have to overcome this simplistic notion of symbolic representation that define the politics of black power. We got to go beyond that. And I think as we do, and think more deeply and substantively about what our interests are, we will gain clarity about how to make those interests felt in the leadership that we choose.
Okay. Minister, let me ask you this, because you've had a lot of success with young people, particularly rappers. But when you think about it, 55% of all African Americans were born after the March on Washington.
That's right.
When these kids are going to college campuses now, these kids weren't born when Jesse ran for president the first time. So how do you give them that historical perspective? How do you connect the two generations?
Thank you. The current generation must not lose sight of where you came from and get so engrossed in what you think is a victory that you fail to teach your children the ground that you came over. There's not a young Jewish child who does not know the ground that they came over because their parents make sure that they understand bitter the chastening rod, you see, stony the road we trod. Somebody has to tell the story. And what happened after Brown versus the Board of Education and the Public Accommodations Bill and the Voting Rights Bill, we got so happy over having achieved what we thought we achieved. We never took the time to teach our children, and we allowed crooked historians.
Yes. Yes.
We allowed people to take Martin Luther King and take his words, his life, and distill it into I have a dream. So when you ask the children, what do you know about Dr. King? Oh, I got a dream. They distill Malcolm X into by any means necessary.
That's it.
But what is the body of knowledge that these men function from? Our children do not know. I was talking to Harry Belafonte the other day, and he was telling me about a lecture that he had given at Howard University recently, and my wife was in attendance. And he said, you know, Brother Farrakhan, I never realized that our children have no understanding of the history of our struggle.
That's right.
Whose fault is that?
That's right.
See, somebody's writing the books, but we're not writing them. Somebody's telling our story,
But it's not us.
but we're not telling it. And they are depriving our children of what was, so our children don't know what is and are not prepared for what is yet to come. I want to close this by dovetailing into something that Dr. Marable said. You know, he said the election was stolen, you know, and it was stolen because you and I believed that by going out in mass numbers, see, we deceived ourselves and our children that Kerry was going to be better for us than Bush. See, but you all are blinded because you want to choose Satan over the devil or Lucifer over Beelzebub, and you end up in hell with anyone that you choose. When are you going to wake up? Now listen to me good. No, let me just say this.
Go ahead. Take your time, man. Take your time.
You were done a favor when Bush won, because Kerry would have lulled you right back to sleep, because you had this, I guess they say, the unmitigated gall to think that that Democratic leader had more for you than Bush, when the reality is, listen to his language. That man never mentioned the poor one time. They talked about how the middle class is squeezed. Is that you? You may be the mayor, but you the working poor. So please, just let me finish this point. Look, and I'm not trying to be in any way disrespectful.
You're fine. You're doing fine. You're doing fine, man.
You know, but your hopes were so high that one slave master's child would do more for you than another. And you were silly enough to allow somebody to call Bill Clinton your first black president, and somebody quoted the man as saying that he did more in his term to undermine affirmative action than all his predecessors combined. But that's because you are blinded by your silly love of your enemy and your hatred of yourself. You want to depend on them rather than depend on your black self to get up off your black rusty dusty and unite and do something to help yourself. I close. I think it's the medication that I'm taking.
Right here.
I'm taking a little pain medication. Listen, family. You know, the poor are the majority in this country.
That's right.
And the poor are left out.
That's right.
The reason Rome hated Jesus is because the poor heard him gladly. If you want to get in trouble, just be an advocate for the poor. If you want to win with the power brokers, let them manipulate you so that the budget in your city is cut to favor them, that the contracts that are given out are given to them, and that you will turn your back on those out of whose ranks you came. See? So for me, you are looking at a free black man. See? No. There's a song, oh, I wish that I knew what it means to be free. See, when you got money, but you yet a slave, because you're afraid that if you make this move, somebody gonna take it from you.
That's right.
You're the mayor of the city, but you're afraid because you want to be governor. So you scratch where you don't itch. And you bend and you bow. It's you. It's not white people. It is your fear of them that keeps you under control. And you need to be made free. Now, I'm a free black man. I paid my way here. Because the mayors, if they had to pay for me to come, there would have been some hell raised. But because I love you, and it was an honor to me to have a chance to talk with you, I pay my own way. Because my people have given me a pocket that I can reach into, that there ain't no white man telling me what to say, when to say it, who to go to. And I wouldn't trade this position to be a multimillionaire that's afraid I have met multi-millionaires that are not free because they're afraid that the enemy will take what they have. I am too old now to go out of this world like well, you know, I'm just too old now. I want to go out and finish my race strong. That even if I die, which I'm going to die anyway, damn it, make up your mind you're going to die for something. And die for the liberation of your people.
Okay. All right.
It's the pain medicine, I think.
You okay? You all right? Let's, somebody in the audience said they want some of that medicine. Let's make a natural transition. And I'm going to ask 2 more questions before we go to the audience. I haven't forgotten about you, okay? Let's talk about the preservation of our black institution. I'm going to start with you on that, Manning.
All right.
We lost Motown. We lost Johnson Hair Products. We lost some of the funeral homes, so we losing from womb to tomb. We lost BET. We lost Essence. Time Warner not only bought Essence, they got Africana.com,
Right.
BlackVoices.com.
That's right.
Particularly when you think about the media. Are we in danger of having our institutions taken away and have no place for free expression?
Oh, brother.
That's absolutely true. As you would know quite well.
Too well.
All too well. I think that part of the root of this, as the minister has been saying this afternoon, is that there was a weakness in the logic of what was behind the civil rights movement. One of the weaknesses was a strategy, a political strategy of what I call symbolic representation, simply getting a black face in a high place that may produce benefits for the masses of people, but increasingly, as you have the breakdown of what a brilliant black scholar, Michael Dawson, refers to as linked fate. See, one of the things about Jim Crow, without ever being, and I'm 54, so I'm not nostalgic for Jim Crow. I know exactly what it was about. In the summers, I used to go down with and Johnny Ford is here from Tuskegee, Alabama. The Maribels, about half of the town are Maribels, right? That's right. So I would go down to Tuskegee in the summer, and you couldn't go to the Dairy Queen and sit down inside. They made you stand outside and eat your ice cream. You couldn't go to the bus depot. You had to sit outside. Up where my dad was born in Wedowee, Alabama, up near Roanoke, in the dry goods store, before they had, a Walmart, they call it a dry goods store, you had to, and I remember as a kid, you had to put your foot, young people won't know what I'm talking about. But older people will know, you couldn't try on a pair of shoes. You had to put your foot on a piece of paper and trace it, and then match it up to some shoes to buy the shoe, right? So when you go through that kind of deep humiliation that basically questions your humanity, forget about race, your basic humanity, you never forget it. You never forget it. And we felt deeply that the sisters and brothers that we advanced as mayors of our cities would never forget it. And many of you have not forgotten it, and you have kept the faith, and you live by that. But some of you did not. And we have to talk truth here. Some of them did not. and then forgot about the constituencies, as the minister quite correctly said, placed them there. But the other critical error that I think within the logic of the civil rights movement was around affirmative action. Now, don't misunderstand me for a microsecond. We have to fight for and defend what is left of affirmative action in the wake of the 2003 Grutter v. Bollinger and Gratz v. Bollinger decisions. Even that has a sunset provision on it. At the end of another 2 decades, even that goes. But the logic of affirmative action, the weakness of it is that, and to be quite honest, and I'll just 2 issues. As a social scientist, is that as a policy of enhancing or empowering the entire black community, it did not actually do that. It generally tended to benefit those of us with advanced educations or who were middle-class people much more so than working-class or low-income people. Just look at the statistics on this. It generally, Ron Walters, a brilliant African-American political scientist, refers to it as paycheck equality. Affirmative action was paycheck equality. It gave us access to jobs that we were prepared for and should have had 40 years earlier. But it did not transfer wealth in the society. It did not compensate us for the historical disadvantage, what I call in my writing historically constructed disadvantage, of the theft of our labor power, the theft of our intelligence and genius, the exploitation of our ability to produce wealth in the society. It did not address that inequality in any substantive way. It wasn't designed to do that. It was paycheck equality. And because we did not in any substantive way address reparations or the compensation for the trillions of dollars of unpaid debt that was owed to us, which has still never been paid to us, and because in part our existing mainstream leadership still is shaky and refuses to address in a substantive way the necessity for a massive compensation for the crimes against humanity that were meted out against African American people, because they lack a historical perspective about their own people, we still find ourselves behind. And just one more thing, since George is not here, I'm going to run on a bit. That, one brilliant, and the brother is here in Columbus, brilliant brother, John Powell, who is in the law school here at Ohio State University. It's his analogy. He did a study where he found, if you look at the baby boomer generation, Americans born between 1946 and 1964, when white Americans in that cohort, when they die, they will bequeath to their children or their grandchildren an estimated, as of 2001 rather, $11 trillion of wealth. But for African Americans in the baby boomer generation, many of you who are here in this audience, we will bequeath to our children debt. Debt. We're in a hole that we will never get out of unless we take emergency action. Emergency action. Why are we in this hole? The average African American household today only has 7% of the net wealth that the typical white household has. That when we look at economic disparity in this country, almost always newspapers focus on salaries and wages. And they talk about the historic disparity between black and white is about 60% to 100. In other words, we earn 60 cents for every dollar the typical white household earns. Forget about wages and salaries, focus on net wealth. Because if you focus on net wealth, you see the disparity is not 60 to 100, it's 7 to 100. The average African American household in this country has only 7% of the wealth of the white household. The typical black household, 1/3 of all black households, has a negative net wealth. It owes more than the total combined assets it has. How do we reverse that? The first step, in part, is devising strategies that break down the barriers within our community and then instill within young women and men the logic and absolute necessity to build institutional capacities of all types. And that's fancy social science language that simply means we have to rely on ourselves to advance ourselves. All right? And this is absolutely crucial. This is absolutely crucial.
In our history in this country, there was such a thing as a slave code of laws, which deprived us of ownership, of the ability to meet together. Where there are 2 or 3, they would break us up. That exists today. When you look at what Brother George Curry advanced about the loss of black institutions, this is real. When you get to a point in this country where you are becoming a multi-millionaire and have a chance to go beyond, what is unseen is the offer that they can't refuse. See, business in this country and in the world is a form of warfare. And as long as you build your business and don't have soldiers, then when you get your business to a certain level, those who have soldiers will give you an offer that you can't refuse. This is why any effort to organize our people to become not just intellectuals, not just entrepreneurs, but to become warriors, to defend and protect what we build, then we will lose what we have. Motown got to a certain point. It's gone now. You know, George Johnson, I loved him. Of is it
Johnson Hair, you're right.
Ultra Sheen. Johnson
Products.
Products. Wonderful, wonderful man. He hired 750 black people in the city of Chicago. And when I got a loan from Muammar Gaddafi of $5 million to make personal care products, I went to my brother, who was also I think he was the chairman of the board of Independence Bank in Chicago. And I put $5 million in the black bank at less interest than I would have got in a white bank. But I had to be true to what I teach. I went to my brother, and we engaged his scientists to produce a product line for us. But because of the cry of anti-Semitism, which is false, I want you to know I have not, nor am I now, a hater of Jewish people. To hate somebody because of their faith tradition would make me what they charge me of being, okay? I'm not that. But naturally, you have to meet me in order to get to know me. It's unfortunate that you know me through the media, which is not controlled by us. Okay. Now, these people who are in the power of distribution told Mr. Johnson, if you make a product for him, Farrakhan, we'll pull all your products off the shelves. So Mr. Johnson called me and he said, Brother Farrakhan, as much as I would like to, these people will put me out of business. He said, I just can't do it, brother. And I said, okay. And about maybe a month or so later, they came to my little office and asked me to take the money out of their bank. Now, most of you, I mean, the little brother or sister who don't sit in the seat of a mayor, who don't know what it's like to become a big businessman, but a big black businessman. You think your black business giants are giants, but they're midgets. But they look like giants to us because we have nothing. But they know they're midgets. Now watch this. I had to take the money out of the bank because they requested it. Okay. You've heard of Don King? He's one of the greatest promoters that boxing has ever had. He sat at my table and he said to me, he had a meeting with the executives of HBO, Time Warner, and he said, they said to me, Brother Farrakhan, that I am a flea and they are an elephant, and they will crush the flea. Oprah Winfrey is one of the most beautiful women that you will find on this planet. Her heart is absolutely a wonderful, wonderful heart. She would not have Farrakhan on her show. Mr. Johnson of Ebony, dear friend, for years, I couldn't even be in Ebony as one of the 100 most influential black men because of the advertisers. And what you may not see are the strings that are attached to black intellectuals, to black professionals, to blacks in the art and culture. Years ago, I'm closing now on this, but years ago, the enemy didn't mind if you went out of this world poor. They became your managers, they became your agents. And so when you died, you left nothing to your children, but they can put their children through college on the money that you earned for them. Reverend Jesse Jackson recently talked about 90% of our young giants in basketball in college never graduate. And it's not because they're good enough to go to the NBA. They use them until they use them up. See? Now, well, what is the solution to this? You know, we're afraid to lose what little we have. And many of us, I'm going to close this with something from Scripture, you know. See, Jesus was a king, but his kingdom had not yet come. Now, you know, sometimes in your own mind, you can see yourself as a very great brilliant, wonderful person, and your dreams always depict you as that. But between your dream and fulfillment, there's God and Satan. Now, Jesus was a king, but his kingdom had not yet come. So Satan said, hey, come on up on this mountain with me. Let me show you something. See all that down there? I control all of that. You bow down to me, and you can have that. Now, if you're not patient to wait on God, Satan will always give it to you, but with strings attached. Now, what does it profit a man to become a mayor or a senator or a congressman or a president of a college and lose your soul? Because with every advancement that you make, there's a string somewhere, and the question is, who is pulling that string? Now, as I leave this, and I'm sorry, you're going to open it up to the public, to the audience. These mayors are looking for solutions to problems. It can't be just politics. As religious people, we have a duty. Dr. Manning Marable, as I sat and listened to my brother, honest to goodness, I feel so confident that there's a brother like this in the world who has such brilliance and is saying things that those of us who are considered radical, we say in another way. But as I listen to him, he's being radicalized. See, the condition of our people
Is so severe.
is making those of us who want to get along but we're hurting now. You see? So the religious people, you got to stop preaching about the afterlife and start taking care of this life. If you take care of this life, the afterlife will take care of itself. Now, all of us as ministers, look at the amount of money we put in the bank on Monday after the collection on Sunday. But we are so divided, we can't pool our resources to create industry. So in the inner cities, when businesses are leaving the inner cities, destroying the tax base, we are still there, but we are not creating economic development for ourselves. And this is why the mobilization of black dollars with black economic know-how is absolutely an imperative today. I sat down with spiritual leaders, listen, and I said, look, brothers, sisters, you got to stop seeing yourself as just the pastor of that little church over there. Getting enough in the charity bucket to take care of your needs. But you got to see yourself as the shepherd of an entire people, because that's the way the scripture calls you. Woe unto the shepherd who feeds himself and not the flock. Economic development cannot happen until there's a change in the mental state of black America. And Harvard is not producing it. Princeton is not producing it. Howard is not producing it. The historically black colleges and universities are not producing it. And if we, with new vision and new thought, don't produce a new mind in our people, then the money will continue to slip through our fingers, and we'll be having meetings like this ad infinitum and woefully saying what white folks are doing to us. They are not doing nothing to us. It's what we refuse to do for ourselves that allows them to continue to do unto us. So in conclusion, the educational institutions of this country are failing to educate. This is a system of training where you're trained to fit into a socio-economic structure that is diametrically opposed to your own freedom. So you fit, you do what you can to fit in. You adopt the manners that allow you to fit. Bless your hearts. We need our educators to develop an educational paradigm to begin to re-educate our people en masse. Our spiritual teachers got to stop using Sunday as an extension of the disco on Saturday night. See, Jesus didn't have no bumping and grinding with him. He had 12 disciples. Not one of them was a guitar player. Not one of them blew no saxophone or beat no drum. The word, properly taught and understood, transformed human life. Be ye not conformed to this world, but be ye what? By what? Well, how can you say your mind is renewed and you think like a slave? And what is a slave? A slave is one whose power and authority are governed by another, and whose sphere of freedom is limited according to the wishes of a master. Now, when I look at black intellectuals, and I mean no disrespect, you go as far as a master say. And if the master say, wait a minute, you're treading on dangerous ground, then we've got to retreat and find another way to do what we do. This is slavery. And this is what others call anti-Semitism. I'm not against Jewish people. I'm against inordinate control of black expression. I'm against that. And I don't care who it is. I should be free to express what God has put within me, not what some other man say I'm able to do. This man should be able to write freely, think freely, and express. Now, as a cultural man, a man of music, Michael Jackson, in his album History, started saying, something like, do me, Jew me, like me, kike me, or something like that. And they told him, you got to take all of that off the shelf. They brought back every album and made him change it. But our artists can call our women bitches and whores. We can talk about killing each other. We can talk about smoking another nigger. This is your language. But that's acceptable. So that's why I want us to mobilize. Because whether you are sick of it or not, there's a number of people in this country that are tired of the condition that is considered our reality. And nobody's going to change it for us but us. Even God, listen to me good now, is not going to change it. God says in the Quran, which is the book of scripture of the Muslim, Allah will never change the condition of a people until they change within themselves. So we've got to change. Dr. Marable said, get your house in order. And the Bible says, if my people, which are called by my name, will first humble themselves and pray and seek my face, but don't stop there, and turn from your wicked ways. He said, then will I hear from heaven, forgive your sins, and heal your land. It ain't about the government. It's about us. And when we make the turn, we'll force government to respond properly to us. White folk is not your enemy. Your ignorance is your enemy. And if we defeated our ignorance, we will defeat all their plans to keep us where they would like us to be.
Now, first I want to thank George Curry for doing my job. But we're running behind in our schedule, and Mr. Curry asked, could we stay in here till 5 o'clock? So I'm taking the prerogative as the moderator of this panel will say, yes, we're going to stay till 5 o'clock.
Oh, yeah. What time is it?
Now, all the mayors are going to beat up on me because we do have business meeting and board meeting. 5 o'clock, we all going to go out that door. Now, if the rest of y'all want to stay, that's all right, but the mayors are going out that door at 5 o'clock. All right?
Let's
So
spend
you
the
can
last
take the
20
questions.
minutes with questions. Only from questions. I'll just shut up.
Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead, sister. And let's do this so that we can get to more people. I know everybody here can and like to speak, but we're not going to have that kind of party. So just ask the question and we can get to more people, okay? Go ahead.
I am Queen Mother Dr. Blakely, and I carry the legacy of Queen Mother Moore, who carried reparation for us. And reparation is as important that is on the table today. The question that I bring from Harlem, since I'm the community mayor of Harlem, and we did host you in Harlem during Mayor David Dinkins in New York City. Divine intervention in the spirit of Queen Mother Moore and my ancestors, and the God within me, I ask, what strategies do we use to bring about solutions and implementation for our people?
Thank you.
If I may say, the simplest thing, but yet the most difficult. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad said these words.
No.
The unity of us as a people will solve 90% of all our problems. Because everything we need is already among us. The only thing that's missing is our unity as a people. And the moment we decide, and we are deciding now, to forego our differences, to come together, to look at and to solve the problems of our people, your real enemy will show his hand at that point, because they'll try to break up our unity. Our unity, he said, is more powerful than a hydrogen or an atomic bomb. And if they are interested in weapons of mass destruction to defeat weapons of mass deception, we need the unity of us in mass construction of a community and a people for the glory of God.
In the interest of time, everybody's not going to respond to both questions, and so you keep your question direct, and we'll try to get the answers direct, and we can get more people. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
Thank you, everyone, for taking a moment to listen. I wanted to make a quick statement and then ask a question.
No statements.
Oh,
Questions.
I just want to say thank you. That was the statement.
Okay, well, then we through with that.
And then the
Thank
question is, we talk about helping. It seems from the outside in all these social programs. Are there any programs that the cities are promoting, fatherhood initiatives and motherhood initiatives? Because that's the first line of defense,
Gotcha.
not social services.
Okay, gotcha. The answer is yes? Yes. Yes. Next. Got to roll.
My question is to Minister Farrakhan. I attended the 1995 Million Man March on Washington as an editorial columnist. I intend to attend again. My question to you is, do you find that the need for atonement is the same as it was 10 years ago?
Even more so now. Even more so now. You know, some were disappointed at the results of the Million Man March, and that is because of your level of expectancy. My level of expectancy was that I wanted to show the world black men civilized, black men loving black men, to combat the image that the world had seen of black men as gangs, as killers, as drug dealers, as criminals. And what Hollywood was doing was setting the stage for the mass murder of our young men. So that one event sent a picture around the world of nearly 2 million men standing together for 14 hours, not one incident. It never happened before, and the reason that it happened was because under it was a spiritual base of atonement, reconciliation, and responsibility, and our people need that now more than ever because of the petty divisions that are among us even as we speak.
Okay, thank you.
Brother David had to get me in here. That's why I don't look like everybody else.
Don't worry about that,
You
brother.
fine.
Don't worry about that. Just ask
You
the
look
question.
just like everybody else.
I mean, my attire.
We're all right with that.
I got a question. Don't you think we're farther ahead than what we give ourselves credit? And if a lot of these people in this room like ride through the community and stop by and conversate with people who they see dressed in red and blue hanging out, wouldn't that make it a little better?
Gotcha. Manny?
Well, let's put it this way. I mean, if you measure the 30 years between the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 to the Million Man March in 1995, the way the federal government at least measures what is middle class, the African American middle class quadrupled in that 30-year period, increased by 400%. Black business during that 30-year period, in terms of its the amount of capital generated in revenue, increased something like 12-fold. But the number of black people below the poverty level increased 300%. So that what we're looking at is a growing division and stratification within our community of not one, but really 3 communities. There's a black professional, managerial, kind of elite, upper middle class that is doing remarkably well. Remarkably well. There's a black working class that is steadily losing ground. And there is a black struggling poor and prisoners and young people that are experiencing nothing less than a social and economic holocaust. Yes. And all of that is combined within the same racialized social body of Black America, the 40 million people of African descent. So that it is far more complex to address what ails our people because of the stratification within the community. That's why overcoming the petty differences that the minister has stressed quite correctly this afternoon, is really the key toward healing and redeeming ourselves. Because ultimately, unless we develop models that are successful and learn from what the social work people refer to as best practices, there are hundreds and hundreds of local models where we have put together, whether it's economic development or addressing criminal justice or addressing health care, using black dollars, best practices where we have made a critical difference. But throughout the country, we don't know about that. If we could overcome the petty differences between organizations, learn from the best practices of the various groups, we could begin to see a turnaround and a change.
Very good. We got 15 minutes. Yes, sister.
Okay, this question is for Minister Farrakhan. As you know, the Ohio Republican Party condemned and criticized this organization for inviting you here. Do you think that when blacks get together in conferences and conventions such as this, or try to develop any different alliances with one another, with people that they may or may not approve of, do you think that the scrutiny with alliances among black people, or do you think there is more scrutiny with alliances among black people that is maybe unfair compared to when maybe the U.S. Conference of Mayors or other groups get together?
Gotcha.
My dear sister, last night
I have to address this too.
Last night I saw something on television about President Bush accepting an invitation to speak at a college where the head of that college called the Pope the Antichrist. Now, I never said what the paper said that I said. All of that is absolute lies, except that I said that Hitler was a wickedly great man, and I described him accurately. That's right. Now, but for them to use lies and half-truths to put fear, this is all it is, in you all as mayors, so you could disinvite your brother who you know made a significant contribution to your meeting. By having me here, you gained. By keeping me away from here, you would have lost what you gained. And who would be the winner then? Your enemies. Now, why do the enemy not want you and me to be together? It's because what I know and who I am and what I am is contagious. You don't put a lion around another lion that's acting like a pussycat.
All right, listen up. I'm going to do something to make sure that everyone in line gets it. Right now, don't nobody else get in line. We'll get a chance to ask their questions. So what I'm going to do is take every question right now. Ask a question and sit down, and then we'll have time for them to respond, and they'll be 5 o'clock. So let's get everybody, briefly as you can, no speeches, no introduction, question, and goodbye.
Okay.
Yeah.
This question is from Minister Farrakhan. How do you think the message of the Million Man March can get through to young boys who are young men today who are about 20 years old, who were little boys back when the first march came around? And what is the black woman's role in this mobilization?
Okay, next. We're going to get all of them right here one time.
Dr. Marable spoke about symbolic representation. Next year is a very strong possibility that Ohio will have to choose from either a black Democrat or a black Republican for the next governor. Right. How can we ensure that whomever we go to the polls and vote for actually represents the interests of black people and not the other people?
Gotcha. Next.
My question has to do with gentrification, that we're losing land in many of the cities. Black people are being pushed out. And I want to know the panel's advice to the mayors on how to deal with gentrification, an urgent problem throughout Black America.
Perfect. Thank y'all for being so cooperative. We're going to get through this. Yes, sir.
Yes, to Minister Farrakhan and the panel, assalamu alaikum. Can we and should we form our own party, political party. You hear Republican, Democrats. That's all you hear all the time. And can we do that? And should we do that? Assalamu alaikum.
Sister, get the last one.
My question is, to what point do we truly and critically involve young people in this process? Does our leadership do that without our leadership becoming threatened by those young people moving forward in the movement? When do our leadership know when to stand up and when to take their seat?
Go ahead, girl.
Thank you. Okay, we have. I'll say that one for last. We have 8 minutes. Each of you have 4 minutes to address what you want out of that, and we'll be on time.
All right.
Okay, who goes first?
All right. Let me be very uncharacteristically brief.
Please.
All right. Number one, there was a question about what do people do. Well, I'll just speak to a couple of the questions. Prior to that series of questions, there was a previous question that the minister spoke to that I didn't get a chance to speak to. We should never apologize for talking with anyone within our own community. Ever. Ever. That if you think about this historically, I'm a historian basically, that, Garvey and Du Bois, had they been able to broker an understanding, then Black America would have been the victor rather than the loser. When I'm writing right now a biography of, as the minister knows, of Brother Malcolm X. That's a big project. I just finished with Murley Evers a book on Medgar that'll come out on June 1st. But the main project is on Malcolm. That what paralyzed the FBI and the CIA was the image of Martin and Malcolm shaking hands and unifying with each other. There is a reason why they fear our unity, because the foundation of American democracy was built on our backs and our exploitation. And that when, as my granny used to say, when the bottom of anything moves, everything on the top moves with it. When we get our act together and our house in order, we build our own institutionalized strength. Everything on top moves with it. That's why it's so critical for those who oppose true democracy in this country to splinter, divide, and relegate us to the margins. And the best way to do that is to have us bickering with ourselves. I have about 2 minutes. For 1.5, I can't even speak about gentrification. Party. The Democrats and the Republicans, I spent a long time back, as some of you in this room know who are in Columbus. We tried to build, about 30 years ago, National Black Political Assembly. It was very strong here in this state. As well as about 20 years ago, we tried to build a black political party. For all kinds of reasons, the American electoral system doesn't lend itself to the development of third parties. The Democrats and Republicans aren't really political parties. They are electoral coalitions of a variety of groups that hang together because they want to feed at the trough. I mean, that's a reality. So you have a structural barrier for third parties being successful. What I would strongly argue instead with Lonnie Guinier is that we have to push toward, if we want to talk about electoral intervention, we have to democratize the system. We need to move away from winner-take-all elections. We need to have things, we need to move towards something like proportional representation voting. We need to restore voting rights to the people who have been disenfranchised. We need to change election laws to make it mandatory to vote in the United States. Voting instead of on Tuesday, on a Sunday, right? When people aren't working. So you could see models where the voter turnout could be 75, 80%. Those in both political parties really do not want people to vote. That's the dirty secret of American electoral democracy, but it is in our interest to get everybody out because we outnumber blacks, Latinos, working people, and low-income people who have a vested interest to see fundamental change if we outnumber them. So that the reality is that the tiny 2% of the country that owns a greater net wealth than the bottom 98% of the country, that is that group that want to make sure that people are not engaged in the political process. It is in our interest to change those laws to affect real change for our people.
Okay, thank you.
Now, to take the little brother who said and he didn't look like the rest of us, but wouldn't it be better if some of us could go out in the street and talk to our
That's right.
people? Yes, of course, my dear brother. But the classes, which I suspect